On October 17, 1847, in the remote hills outside Sainte Marguerite, Quebec, Father Antoine Beliveau made a discovery that would haunt the Catholic Church for generations and remain buried in Vatican archives for 176 years. The young priest had arrived at the Convent of Divine Mercy, expecting to conduct morning mass for the 32 sisters who had maintained a vow of silence for the past 11 years. What he found instead was a scene that defied comprehension. 29 nuns, aged between 19 and 63, seated in perfect formation in the chapel choir loft, their hands folded in prayer, their eyes open and staring at the crucifix, all of them dead for what the coroner would later estimate to be 3 to 5 days. But death was not the horror that would cause Father Beliveau to collapse on the chapel floor, his own screams echoing through the stone corridors. It was what he discovered when Sister Catherine, the youngest at 19, suddenly gasped and moved. She was alive, barely. As he rushed to help her, cradling her head as she tried to speak, he saw what would be confirmed in each of the 29 corpses. Their tongues had been surgically removed, the wounds cauterized with precision that spoke of medical knowledge, not random mutilation. The records of what truly happened at the Convent of Divine Mercy were sealed by papal decree in 1848. The buildings burned to the ground, the land salted and declared unhallowed. The 3 survivors, for 2 more who were found alive in the cellar, were relocated to asylums in France, their testimonies locked away in archives that wouldn't be opened for over a century and a half. What force could drive someone to systematically silence an entire convent? And more disturbing still, why did the Church work so diligently to ensure this story would never be told? The answer lies not in madness or random violence, but in something far more calculated, something that began not with the first cut, but with a single question asked 11 years before. What secrets do the sisters know that God Himself would want silenced? Before we continue with the systematic horrors that unfolded at the Convent of Divine Mercy, if this story intrigues you, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what I'm about to reveal from these newly unsealed documents will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious institutions in early North America. I want to build a community of true mystery seekers here, people brave enough to confront the darkness that others would prefer stayed buried. So tell me in the comments below, what state or city are you from? I'm curious to know if any of you are from Quebec, or if your own local history might be hiding similar secrets that the authorities never wanted exposed. Only the bravest viewers make it through stories like these. The weak-hearted have already clicked away. But you're still here, aren't you? You're one of the true seekers, the ones who understand that sometimes the most terrifying monsters wear the most trusted faces. Let's discover together what really happened in those stone walls and why 32 women chose silence, before silence was forced upon them forever. Sainte Marguerite in 1847 was a town suspended between 2 worlds. With a population of barely 3,000 souls, it clung to the southeastern hills of Quebec like a forgotten prayer, 40 miles from any settlement large enough to warrant a postal route. The town's economy revolved around 3 pillars: timber from the vast forests that pressed against its borders, a small but productive iron mine that employed nearly 200 men, and the Convent of Divine Mercy, which drew pilgrims from across Lower Canada seeking healing from the Holy Sisters. The social structure was rigid, typical of French Catholic settlements of the era. At the apex sat Monsignor Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, who oversaw not just the spiritual welfare of Sainte Marguerite, but controlled much of its temporal power as well. The Monsignor, then 71 years old, had served the diocese for 43 years, his influence extending from the selection of the town magistrate to the approval of marriages among the merchant class. Below him in the hierarchy was Dr. Lucian Martel, the town's only physician, who had studied at the prestigious Université Laval before returning to his birthplace to practice medicine. At 45, Dr. Martel was considered progressive for his time, having introduced several modern surgical techniques to the frontier town. His medical opinions carried the weight of law, and his regular visits to the convent to tend to the sisters' health needs made him one of the few outsiders permitted beyond the entrance parlor. The Convent of Divine Mercy itself had been established in 1824 by Mother Superior Marie-Claire Duchesne, a woman of remarkable intellect who had fled France during the revolutionary upheavals. Under her guidance, the convent had grown from a simple wooden structure housing 5 sisters to an impressive stone complex that could accommodate 40. The sisters operated a small hospital for the poor, an orphanage that cared for up to 20 children at any time, and maintained extensive herb gardens whose remedies were sought throughout the province. The remoteness that made Sainte Marguerite ideal for contemplative religious life also made it perfect for keeping secrets. Mail arrived irregularly, sometimes delayed by weeks during harsh winters. The nearest bishop resided in Montreal, a journey of 3 days in good weather, nearly impossible during the 5 months of winter that gripped the region. The sisters themselves, having taken vows of stability, never left the convent grounds once they entered. Supplies were delivered weekly by local merchants, but always received at the gate by the portress, Sister Anne, the only nun-permitted regular contact with the outside world. By 1836, 11 years before the horror would unfold, the convent had gained a new spiritual advisor, Father Etienne Beaumont, a 34-year-old priest whose scholarly reputation and connections in Rome had earned him the position despite his relative youth. Father Beaumont was a student of church history, fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. His arrival was seen as a blessing, a sign that even this remote convent was worthy of the church's finest minds. What the townspeople didn't know was that Father Beaumont had been sent to Sainte Marguerite not as a reward, but as a form of exile. His research into early church texts, particularly the Gnostic Gospels and certain apocryphal works, had drawn unwanted attention from his superiors. His transfer to this forgotten corner of Quebec was meant to end his controversial studies. Instead, it would provide him with the perfect laboratory for an experiment in faith, obedience, and the limits of human endurance. The convent's decision to adopt a vow of complete silence in 1836, just months after Father Beaumont's arrival, was seen as a sign of exceptional devotion. The sisters would communicate only through written notes and sign language, dedicating their voices entirely to God through their renowned choir performances during Mass. The townspeople, accustomed to the sisters' beautiful singing that could be heard drifting from the chapel windows, saw this as the ultimate sacrifice. They didn't question why Father Beaumont was the only one permitted to hear their confessions, or why he had ordered the construction of a new confessional with unusually thick walls and a peculiar acoustic design that he claimed would carry their sins directly to heaven. Father Etienne Beaumont cultivated his image with the meticulous care of a master gardener tending prize roses. To the citizens of Sainte Marguerite, he embodied everything a spiritual leader should be: learned yet humble, strict yet compassionate, devoted to God yet attentive to earthly suffering. His sermons drew crowds from neighboring settlements, people traveling hours through difficult terrain to hear him expound on divine mercy and the redemptive power of suffering. The priest's daily routine appeared beyond reproach. He rose at 4 a.m. for matins, was seen walking the convent grounds in prayer until sunrise, conducted morning mass with theatrical devotion, and spent his afternoons visiting the sick and dying in town. Merchants spoke of his generosity. He paid above market rates for supplies delivered to the convent, always with a blessing and often with a small gift for the merchant's children. Women of the town compared him favorably to saints, noting how he would spend hours at the bedside of the ill, never showing fatigue or impatience. Dr. Lucian Martel, who would later become an unwitting enabler of unspeakable acts, wrote in his journal in 1837, "Father Beaumont possesses a remarkable understanding of anatomy and medicine for a man of the cloth. His questions about surgical procedures and healing techniques show a sharp scientific mind. I have begun consulting with him on difficult cases, particularly those involving ailments of the throat and tongue. His insights have proven invaluable." The doctor had no way of knowing that Beaumont's medical interests extended far beyond healing. The priest had requested detailed anatomical texts from Montreal, claiming he needed to better understand God's design of the human body to appreciate divine creation. He borrowed Dr. Martel's surgical instruments to better understand the tools of mercy, returning them cleaned and sharpened with such precision that the doctor remarked on their improved quality. Sheriff Claude Thibodeau, a bear of a man who had kept order in Sainte Marguerite for 15 years, considered Father Beaumont above suspicion. When strange deliveries began arriving at the convent, crates marked theological supplies that required special handling, the sheriff personally ensured their safe transport. "A man so devoted to God's work deserves our protection," he told his deputies. The crates, which arrived monthly from Montreal, were unusually heavy and packed with ice even in winter, but Thibodeau never thought to question their contents. The merchant Joseph Laflamme, who held the exclusive contract to supply the convent, noticed changes after Father Beaumont's arrival, but interpreted them as signs of prosperity. Orders for preserved foods doubled, then tripled. Requests for specialty items, particular herbs, tinctures, and large quantities of wine for communion purposes, became regular. The priest paid in gold coins, unusual for a remote convent, but Laflamme wasn't one to question good fortune. He did find it odd that deliveries were now to be made exclusively to a new entrance at the north wall, far from the main gate, but Father Beaumont explained this was to avoid disturbing the sisters' contemplation. Early warning signs were consistently misinterpreted or explained away with disturbing ease. When Sister Marguerite was seen at a window making frantic gestures, townspeople assumed she was practicing the new sign language the Silent Order had adopted. When screams were heard from the convent one night in 1838, Father Beaumont explained that Sister Agnes had suffered from night terrors since childhood, a condition he was treating with prayer and herbal remedies. The explanation satisfied everyone, even when the screams continued monthly, always around the new moon when the nights were darkest. The convent's request for heavier doors with specialized locks was seen as prudent security against the occasional vagrant or wild animal. When Father Beaumont ordered the windows of the sisters' cells modified, bars added to prevent accidents, glass painted black to encourage interior contemplation, the workmen praised his concern for the sisters' safety and spiritual development. The carpenter, Henry Dubois, later recalled feeling uneasy about the specifications but dismissed his concerns. "Who was I to question a man of God?" Perhaps most telling was the change in the sisters themselves during their rare appearances at chapel windows or in the garden. Their movements had become synchronized, almost mechanical, lacking the individual quirks that had once distinguished Sister Marie's energetic stride from Sister Therese's gentle glide. But the townspeople, seeing them only at distance and in groups, attributed this to their deepening spiritual discipline, their individual selves dissolving into collective devotion. The one person who might have recognized the signs was Mother Superior Marie-Claire Duchesne herself, but after a severe illness in late 1836, just months after Father Beaumont's arrival, she was rarely seen. The priest explained she had suffered an apoplexy that left her weakened but still capable of governing the convent through written instruction. He served as her voice, reading her letters to the bishop, always reporting that the convent flourished under his guidance. No one thought to ask why her handwriting, once flowing and distinctive, had become cramped and almost childlike, or why she never appeared at the window of her cell to wave at the townspeople who gathered on her feast day to sing her favorite hymns. The first crack in Father Beaumont's carefully constructed facade appeared in September 1847, just weeks before the final horror would be discovered. Marie Gauthier, a laundress who collected the convent's linens weekly, noticed something that made her stomach turn. Blood, too much blood, soaking through bundle after bundle of white cloth. When she mentioned this to Father Beaumont, he explained that several sisters had been afflicted with consumption, coughing blood into their handkerchiefs. But Marie had washed linens for consumptives before. This blood was different, darker, mixed with something that looked like burnt tissue, and the stains formed patterns suggesting deliberate application rather than coughing fits. Marie brought her concerns to Dr. Martel, who initially dismissed them. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The doctor began to recall peculiarities he had previously ignored. Father Beaumont's intense interest in the anatomy of the tongue and throat, his requests for specific surgical instruments, his questions about cauterization techniques. More troubling, the priest had recently asked about the effects of various herbs on blood clotting and pain suppression, knowledge that seemed unnecessary for spiritual guidance. The second incident occurred on October 3rd, when 12-year-old Thomas Bertrand, delivering firewood to the convent's back entrance, heard something that would haunt him into old age. Through a ground-level window, partially open despite the autumn chill, came a sound he couldn't immediately identify, a wet, rhythmic gurgling like someone trying to scream underwater. Then he saw shadows moving against the candle-lit wall inside. Multiple figures holding down a struggling form while another figure, taller and wearing what looked like a priest's cassock, leaned over with something glinting in his hand. Thomas ran home and told his father, who beat him for telling lies about a holy man. But the boy's mother, Celeste Bertrand, believed her son. She had noticed that no sisters had appeared at the convent's windows for nearly 2 weeks, unusual for an order that, despite their silence, had always maintained visual connection with the townspeople. She began keeping watch, and what she observed chilled her. Father Beaumont entering the convent at unusual hours, always through different doors, always carrying a black leather satchel that seemed to move as if something inside were trying to escape. Dr. Martel's moment of horrible clarity came on October 10th. He had been called to examine Father Beaumont, who claimed to have cut his hand while pruning roses in the convent garden. The wound was minor, but what caught the doctor's attention was the priest's other hand. Under his fingernails were traces of what appeared to be dried blood and tissue, too much to be explained by a gardening accident. More disturbing still, when the doctor cleaned the wound, he noticed the priest's surgical scars on his fingers, the kind that came from years of holding scalpels, not from holding prayer books. "Father," Dr. Martel ventured carefully, "your hands show the marks of a surgeon. Beaumont's eyes, usually warm and paternal, turned cold as winter stone. "We all serve God with different gifts, Doctor. Mine simply extends beyond the spiritual." The pattern was forming in Dr. Martel's mind like a terrible constellation. The medical knowledge, the surgical instruments, the screams in the night, the blood-soaked linens, the sisters' increasing absence from public view. But his rational mind resisted the implications. This was a priest, a man of God, shepherd to 32 souls who had devoted their lives to Christ. What he was beginning to suspect was not just criminal but sacrilegious, a violation of every sacred trust. The doctor's investigation intensified. He began making unexpected visits to the convent under the pretense of checking on the sisters' health, only to be turned away by Father Beaumont, who claimed the sisters were in extended prayer or ritual purification. He consulted his medical texts about tongue removal. Why would anyone do such a thing? The historical precedents were horrifying: punishment for blasphemy, silencing of witnesses, ancient rituals of sacrifice. On October 15th, 2 days before Father Bellevaux's arrival would expose everything, Dr. Martel made a decision that would torment him forever. He had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to approach Sheriff Thibodeau, but he hesitated. To accuse a priest of such monstrous acts without absolute proof would destroy his own reputation, possibly result in excommunication. He decided to wait, to gather more evidence, to be certain. Those 48 hours of hesitation would cost lives. The night of October 16th brought the most damning evidence yet. Madame Yvette Laroche, widow and insomniac, lived in a cottage that overlooked the convent cemetery. Just after midnight, she saw Father Beaumont and 2 figures in nuns' habits carrying something wrapped in sheets to a freshly dug grave. But instead of lowering it respectfully, they threw it in with hurried, guilty movements. When they left, Madame Laroche crept to the grave with her lantern. What she saw sent her running to Dr. Martel's house. A pale hand had worked free from the sheets, and in the lantern's light she could see that the fingers were still moving. Dr. Martel and Sheriff Thibodeau arrived at the cemetery within the hour. What they exhumed would finally shatter their disbelief. Sister Beatrice, age 43, still warm, her mouth a horror of surgical modification. Her tongue had been removed with medical precision, the wound cauterized to prevent bleeding out, but infection had set in. She had been buried alive, too weak to claw her way out but conscious enough to suffer. She lived just long enough to trace letters in the dirt with her finger. Beaumont, and then with her last strength, a LL. The discovery scene that followed when Father Bellevaux arrived for morning mass on October 17th was a descent into methodical hell. The young priest, only 28 and newly ordained, had come to celebrate the feast of Saint Marguerite with the sisters. He found the convent's front door unlocked, unusual but not alarming. The entrance hall was empty, silent in a way that felt wrong, not the peaceful silence of contemplation, but the oppressive quiet of a held breath. He called out, his voice echoing off stone walls. No response. He moved deeper into the convent, noting that all the doors stood open, as if someone had made a hurried search or escape. The smell hit him first: copper and corruption, death and something else, something medicinal. He followed it to the chapel, where his rational mind simply stopped functioning for several moments, unable to process what his eyes were seeing. 29 nuns sat in the choir loft in perfect formation, 3 rows of still figures in pristine habits. Their hands were folded in prayer, rosaries wrapped around fingers that had turned blue-black with pooled blood. Their eyes were open, fixed on the crucifix above the altar. But their mouths, God in heaven, their mouths were dark caverns, lips pulled back in permanent silent screams. dried blood forming black tears down their chins and staining their white wimples. Father Beliveau stumbled forward, his legs moving without conscious command. He had to be certain they were dead, had to confirm this wasn't some impossible mass miracle of suffering saints. He reached the first row, touched Sister Catherine's shoulder. She was cold, stiff, but then she moved, a tiny shudder, and a sound escaped her ruined mouth that would echo in his nightmares forever. Not quite a moan, not quite a word, but something between the two, the sound of a soul trying to speak without the means to form words. If this is giving you chills, you're not alone. I had to stop multiple times while researching these Vatican archives, and I've been investigating historical crimes for over a decade. The systematic nature of what Father Beaumont did, it transcends simple madness. This was calculated, methodical evil hiding behind a collar and crucifix. Please hit that share button. People need to know these stories, need to understand that monsters don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they stand at pulpits, sometimes they hear our confessions. Give this video a like if you're still with me, because I promise you, what I'm about to reveal next will change how you view religious institutions forever. Let's discover together what Father Beaumont's true purpose was, because removing 29 tongues wasn't the goal. It was just the beginning. The real horror lies in what he was trying to achieve, what ancient ritual he believed he was completing, and why the Catholic Church worked so desperately to bury this truth. Are you ready? Because once you know what's coming next, you can't unknow it. When Dr. Martel and Sheriff Thibodeau entered the convent with a team of deputies on the morning of October 17th, what they found exceeded their worst fears. Father Beliveau, in a state of near catatonic shock, had managed to lead them to Sister Catherine and the two other survivors found in the cellar. Sister Marie Joseph, age 31, and Sister Therese, age 52. All three had undergone the same surgical mutilation, their tongues removed with medical precision, but they had somehow survived the subsequent infection that killed their sisters. The physical evidence discovered throughout the convent painted a picture of prolonged, systematic torture disguised as religious devotion. In Father Beaumont's private chamber, a room that should have contained only sparse furnishings befitting a priest, investigators found a makeshift surgical theater. A wooden table, its surface grooved from repeated scrubbings but still stained dark with blood. Leather straps attached to the corners, worn smooth from struggling limbs. A collection of surgical instruments that Dr. Martel recognized with horrible familiarity. The very tools he had lent to Father Beaumont over the years, plus others of more sinister design, mouth spreaders, tongue clamps, specialized cauterizing irons shaped to seal specific wound patterns. On a shelf above this table of horrors sat 32 glass jars filled with a clear preservation solution. 29 contained human tongues, labeled with names and dates stretching back to 1836. The 3 empty jars bore the names of the survivors. Each label included not just the sister's name but detailed notes in Latin about the extraction process, the herbs used for sedation, the exact temperature of the cauterizing iron, and disturbingly, a rating system for what Beaumont called spiritual resonance achieved. Dr. Martel, translating the Latin with growing revulsion, discovered that Father Beaumont hadn't removed all the tongues at once. The first had been Mother Superior Marie-Claire Duchesne's in December 1836, shortly after her illness. The priest's notes described in clinical detail how he had convinced her that her inability to speak was God's will, that her sacrifice would sanctify the entire convent. Drugged with a mixture of opium and herbs that left her conscious but paralyzed, she had been unable to resist as he performed his first sacred extraction. The testimonies of the survivors, painstakingly communicated through written notes and gestures over the following weeks, revealed the true scope of Beaumont's systematic control. After silencing the Mother Superior, he had used her authority, speaking as her voice through forged letters, to gradually implement rules that isolated the sisters from any outside help. The vow of silence hadn't been voluntary. It had been imposed to hide the fact that the Mother Superior could no longer speak. Sister Marie Joseph, her hand shaking as she wrote, revealed how Father Beaumont had presented the tongue removal as a form of ultimate devotion, a sacrifice that would grant them direct communication with God. He had shown them ancient texts, later discovered to be forgeries he had created himself, that described medieval saints who had offered their tongues to achieve spiritual transcendence. He preyed on their faith, their isolation, their complete trust in his authority as their spiritual director. The ritual had been performed monthly, always on the night of the new moon. One sister would be selected, told she had been chosen for a sacred honor. The others would be made to watch, to sing hymns that would mask any sounds of distress. Those who resisted or showed doubt would be drugged, confined to their cells, subjected to what Beaumont called purification through suffering, days of starvation, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture that broke their will. Sister Therese's testimony revealed perhaps the most chilling aspect. Father Beaumont genuinely believed he was conducting holy work. He had spoken to them of visions, of direct communications from angels who told him that the second coming required a choir of the silent, 33 women, matching Christ's age at death, who had willingly surrendered their earthly voices to become vessels for divine song. He believed that once he had completed the ritual with all 32 nuns plus himself as the 33rd, the heavens would open and Christ would return. The systematic approach was documented in a series of journals hidden beneath the floorboards of Beaumont's chamber. Written in a mixture of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, with passages in an unknown script that resembled no known language, these journals traced his descent from controversial theological scholar to apocalyptic fanatic. He had become obsessed with Gnostic texts that spoke of hidden requirements for salvation, convinced that the Church had suppressed the true path to triggering the second coming. His selection of the Convent of Divine Mercy hadn't been random. His research had led him to believe that this specific location, built on what he claimed was a convergence of sacred ley lines, was the only place where the ritual could succeed. The sisters weren't just victims. In his twisted theology, they were martyrs whose sacrifice would save all of humanity. He had spent years studying anatomy and surgical techniques not out of sadistic pleasure, but from a perverted sense of religious duty. He needed to keep them alive after the removal, believing their continued prayers in their purified state were essential to the ritual's success. The discovery of a hidden chamber beneath the chapel revealed the final phase of his plan. Investigators found an elaborate altar surrounded by 33 chairs arranged in a perfect circle. 29 of the chairs contained mummified tongues, preserved and mounted on small gold stands. The tongues had been arranged with copper wires and strange mechanical devices that would cause them to vibrate when activated, creating what Beaumont described in his notes as the true music of the spheres, the song that would call Christ home. Most disturbing were the modifications he had made to the sisters' bodies beyond the removal of their tongues. Dr. Martel discovered that each woman showed signs of repeated bloodletting, their arms scarred with precise incisions. Beaumont had been collecting their blood, storing it in consecrated vessels he had stolen from other churches during his travels. He believed this blood, mixed with communion wine and consumed by the sisters, would transform them into living tabernacles, their bodies becoming literal vessels for Christ's return. The three survivors revealed that October 17th was to be the culmination of Beaumont's plan. After 11 years of preparation, having successfully purified 29 sisters, he intended to remove the tongues of the final three during a special mass. Then, in what he called the Great Sacrifice, all 32 sisters would drink poisoned wine simultaneously while he removed his own tongue, believing their collective death would create a spiritual explosion that would tear open the veil between heaven and earth. But something had gone wrong in the days before. Several sisters had developed severe infections despite his careful cauterization. The massive doses of opiates and herbs he had been administering to keep them compliant had begun to fail. Some sisters had started showing signs of madness, not the religious ecstasy he expected, but genuine psychotic breaks from prolonged torture and drugging. Sister Beatrice's attempted escape and subsequent burial had been a desperate attempt to maintain control as his carefully orchestrated plan began to collapse. The 29 dead sisters in the chapel had not been positioned there as part of the ritual. The survivors revealed that Beaumont, seeing his plan falling apart as infection and madness spread through the convent, had given them all a final massive dose of sedatives mixed with poison on October 14th, arranging their bodies in prayer formation as a last tribute to his failed vision. He had fled that night, leaving the three strongest survivors locked in the cellar to die of thirst, planning to return after Father Bellevaux's visit to complete his work in secret. The search for Father Etienne Beaumont began immediately, but Sheriff Thibaudot's men found his trail had been carefully prepared for years. The priest had maintained multiple identities, with forged documents identifying him as a merchant, a physician, and even a Protestant minister. His room contained maps marking routes to ports in Boston, New York, and Halifax, with ship schedules circled in red ink. But most disturbing was a letter, half burned in his fireplace, that suggested he wasn't working alone. The letter, written in educated French with traces of a Parisian accent in its phrasing, read in part, "The Montreal experiment proceeds as planned. Bishop L. remains unaware, though Father Denis grows suspicious. The Toronto group has secured their location. When your work is complete, we shall synchronize our revelations. The Cardinal's supporters in Rome have ensured the necessary documents remain sealed. Remember, dear brother, we are not heretics but the true faithful, recovering what the Church has hidden for 17 centuries." This fragment sent shockwaves through the investigation. Dr. Martel immediately contacted colleagues in Montreal and Toronto, asking discreet questions about unusual deaths or disappearances in religious communities. The responses he received were carefully worded but deeply troubling. A Dr. Francois Leblanc in Montreal reported that 12 nuns at the Convent of St. Augustine had died of sudden fever 3 months prior, their bodies cremated on order of their spiritual advisor before proper autopsies could be performed. From Toronto came word that an entire monastery of Franciscan brothers, 17 men, had supposedly departed on a mission to the Western Territories, though no church official could confirm where exactly they had gone or who had authorized their journey. The resistance to further investigation came swiftly and from the highest levels. Within a week of the discovery at the Convent of Divine Mercy, Monsignor Jean-Baptiste Rouse received a telegram from the Bishop of Quebec ordering him to cease all cooperation with civil authorities and to confiscate all evidence as church property protected by canon law. The Monsignor, who had initially been horrified by the discoveries, suddenly became obstructive, claiming that the matter was an internal church affair that required no secular intervention. Sheriff Thibaudot found his investigation systematically undermined. Witnesses began recanting their statements, claiming they had been mistaken or coerced. Marie Gauthier, the laundress who had first noticed the blood, disappeared entirely. Her husband claimed she had gone to visit relatives in France, though she had no known family there. Thomas Bertrand's family suddenly came into money, enough to pay off their debts and purchase new land, and the boy's story changed to insist he had seen nothing unusual at the convent. Dr. Martel received a midnight visit from 3 men who claimed to represent concerned parties within the church. They offered him a substantial sum to declare the sisters' deaths the result of a contaminated well, a tragic but natural disaster. When he refused, they shifted from bribery to threats. His medical practice began losing patients as rumors spread that he had performed blasphemous autopsies on holy sisters. His wife received anonymous letters describing in graphic detail what would happen to their children if the doctor continued his unholy crusade against God's servants. But the investigation had gained momentum beyond what could be easily stopped. Father Antoine Beliveau, traumatized but determined, had written detailed letters to newspapers in Montreal and Quebec City before the church could silence him. He was quickly transferred to a monastery in Italy for contemplation and healing, but his accounts had already sparked public interest. More importantly, he had secretly made copies of several of Beaumont's journals, hiding them with a Protestant minister who had no love for the Catholic hierarchy. These journals, when finally examined by scholars who could decode Beaumont's polyglot writing system, revealed a conspiracy that stretched back decades. Beaumont had been part of a secret society within the church called the Custodes Veritas, Guardians of Truth, founded in the 1790s by a group of theologians who believed the church had suppressed essential knowledge about achieving the Second Coming. They had cells throughout North America and Europe, each conducting their own interpretation of what they called preparatory rituals. The historical precedent was chilling. Beaumont's journals referenced similar events throughout history, carefully hidden by the church. A convent in Bavaria in 1423, where 33 nuns were found dead in identical positions, their tongues removed. A monastery in Spain in 1571, where the Inquisition had discovered and executed a group of monks attempting something called the Silence of Saints. A series of disappearances in Italian convents during the 1760s that had been blamed on plague but showed suspicious patterns. Most disturbing was Beaumont's claim that he had learned the ritual from a mentor, a cardinal whose name he never wrote but referred to as the Illuminated One. This figure had supposedly shown Beaumont documents in the Vatican secret archives that contained the true gospel, suppressed writings that described additional requirements for salvation that the church had deemed too extreme for ordinary believers. According to Beaumont, there were dozens of followers of this teaching, all in positions of authority within the church, all working toward their own interpretations of these hidden truths. The investigation uncovered evidence of a broader network when Sheriff Thibaudou's men searched an abandoned cabin 10 miles from the convent. There they found correspondence between Beaumont and at least 7 other priests across North America. Each letter discussed their progress in vague terms, but when compared with death records from their respective regions, a pattern emerged. Unusual deaths in religious communities, always explained as natural causes, always followed by quick burials or cremations. Father Denis Laforme in Montreal, mentioned in the burned letter, was arrested attempting to board a ship to France. In his possession were surgical instruments identical to those found in Beaumont's chamber and a list of names, nuns at the convent of St. Augustine who had not yet undergone purification. His interrogation revealed that the Custodes Veritas had been planning a coordinated event for Christmas Eve 1847, when multiple communities across the continent would complete their rituals simultaneously. Believing this would amplify the spiritual effect and guarantee Christ's return. The Toronto group proved most elusive. When investigators arrived at the monastery of St. Francis, they found it completely abandoned. The 17 brothers had vanished, leaving behind only their habits folded neatly on their beds and a message written in blood on the chapel wall. "We go to prepare the way. The silence begins the song." Local natives reported seeing a group of men in rough clothes heading north into the wilderness, led by a tall figure who walked with the bearing of absolute authority. As the investigation widened, the Church's efforts to contain it intensified. A papal decree arrived declaring that anyone who spoke publicly about the events at the Convent of Divine Mercy would be excommunicated. Catholic newspapers were forbidden from reporting on the story. Church records relating to Father Beaumont, the dead sisters, and even the convent itself began disappearing from diocesan archives. Dr. Martel received a final warning in the form of a package containing a human tongue, not one of the sisters, but fresh, with a note: "Silence is golden. Silence is holy. Silence is survival." The message was clear: continue the investigation, and he would join the victims. But the package had been clumsily delivered, and witnesses saw the courier, who was tracked to a boarding house where investigators found Father Beaumont's accomplice. Brother Thomas, a young monk who had been assisting in the purifications and was preparing to continue the work. Brother Thomas's confession, extracted over 3 days of interrogation, revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The Custodes Veritas weren't just trying to trigger the second coming. They believed they were preventing the apocalypse. According to their interpretation of the suppressed texts, Christ would only return if humanity proved worthy through specific sacrifices. Without these rituals, the world would face not salvation but damnation. In their twisted logic, the torture and murder of innocents was an act of ultimate love, saving billions of souls from eternal hellfire. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of human depravity hiding behind religious authority, the investigation reveals something even more terrifying. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was organized, systematic, and worst of all, it might still be happening. If you're watching this at night alone, I apologize for what I'm about to reveal. But you need to share this video urgently. Share it before it's too late, before someone decides this story needs to disappear again. We're not just talking about historical horror here. We're talking about a network that had tentacles throughout North America, with connections reaching all the way to Rome. You, my true crime family, you understand why these stories matter. You're the ones brave enough to look into the darkness and say, "We will not forget." You're the ones who ensure these victims didn't suffer in vain. Together, we're peeling back layers of lies that have been calcifying for over a century and a half. Stay with me for these final revelations, because what happened to Father Beaumont and his network will shake your faith. Not in God, perhaps, but certainly in those who claim to speak for him. The trial of Brother Thomas began on November 15, 1847, in the courthouse at Quebec City. The proceedings, despite the Church's attempts at suppression, drew crowds that filled the streets. Protestant newspapers, unbound by papal decree, reported every detail, their accounts spreading across North America and eventually reaching Europe. But justice would prove as elusive as Father Beaumont himself. Brother Thomas, whose real name was revealed to be Thomas Arquette, was only 23 years old. The son of devout Catholic immigrants from Lyon, he had been recruited into the Custodes Veritas at age 16 while studying at seminary. His testimony revealed a young man so thoroughly indoctrinated that he showed no remorse, only frustration that the great work had been interrupted. He spoke of the murdered sisters as blessed martyrs and insisted that prosecuting him was tantamount to persecuting Christ himself. The legal proceedings faced immediate challenges. The Church claimed jurisdiction over Brother Thomas as a member of the clergy, demanding he be tried in an ecclesiastical court. The Crown prosecutor, James Morrison, a Protestant Scotsman with no love for Catholic authority, fought this vigorously, but found witnesses mysteriously reluctant to testify. The 3 surviving nuns were declared mentally incompetent by a church-appointed physician. Their written testimonies ruled inadmissible. Dr. Martel's medical evidence was challenged by 3 Catholic doctors who claimed the tongues could have been removed post-mortem by animals, despite the obvious surgical precision. During the trial's 3rd day, a spectacular escape attempt nearly succeeded. A group of armed men, their faces covered, stormed the courthouse during a recess. They killed 2 guards and wounded 3 others before being repelled by sheriff's deputies. Brother Thomas was found in his cell, praying calmly, claiming no knowledge of the attempt. But investigators found a note in his prayer book, "The faithful shall deliver you." The work continues. The trial proceeded under heavy guard, but the damage was done. Several jurors requested to be excused, citing threats against their families. Those who remained were a mixture of Protestants and Catholics, the latter clearly torn between their faith and the evidence before them. Brother Thomas's lawyer, provided by the Church, argued that his client was insane, driven mad by excessive religious devotion, a victim himself of Father Beaumont's manipulation. The verdict, when it came on December 3rd, was guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, but not guilty of murder itself, as Brother Thomas had not personally killed any of the sisters. The sentence should have been life imprisonment, but the judge, after receiving a private visit from the Bishop of Quebec, reduced it to 20 years. The courtroom erupted in chaos, Protestant observers crying for true justice, while Catholic supporters proclaimed it excessive punishment for a man of God. But Brother Thomas would never serve his sentence. On December 7th, 4 days after the verdict, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause was listed as suicide by hanging, though the guards on duty claimed they had checked on him just minutes before and found him sleeping peacefully. No investigation was conducted into how he obtained the rope, why the guards had simultaneously decided to take a break, or why his body showed signs of strangulation inconsistent with hanging. The search for Father Beaumont intensified, but yielded only false leads and dead ends. A man matching his description was reportedly seen boarding a ship in Boston bound for Portugal, another in Halifax heading for Ireland. The most credible sighting came from a priest in Mexico City who claimed Beaumont had sought shelter at his church, speaking of a mission to prepare the Southern faithful. By the time investigators arrived, the trail was cold. Then, in February 1848, a package arrived at Dr. Martel's office. Inside was Father Beaumont's journal, his final one, and a letter written in his unmistakable hand. "Dear Doctor, by the time you read this, I shall be beyond the reach of earthly justice, having submitted myself to the ultimate judgment. You think me a monster, but history will vindicate the faithful. What we attempted was not murder but midwifery, birthing a new age through necessary sacrifice. The sisters understood in the end, their eyes, even in death, looked toward paradise. The work continues, though not by my hand. There are others more careful than I, more patient. They have learned from my failures. They will not seek to hasten the kingdom through such direct means, but will prepare the faithful through subtler purifications. Watch your churches, Doctor." Watch your convents and monasteries. When children begin disappearing, when novitiates are found dead of mysterious illnesses, when entire congregations vanish into the wilderness seeking revelation, you will know the Custodes Veritas endures. I go now to offer my own tongue to God, the 33rd sacrifice, though performed by my own hand rather than in communion with my blessed sisters. Perhaps this solitary offering will suffice. Perhaps the gates will still open. If silence falls across the world at the next Easter moon, you will know I succeeded. May God forgive you for interrupting his work. Father Etienne Beaumont, servant of the true faith, the letter was postmarked from Louisiana, but searches there found nothing. However, 3 months later, newspapers in New Orleans reported the discovery of an unidentified man's body in the bayou, missing his tongue, with surgical instruments and religious texts scattered around him. The body was too decomposed for positive identification, but a gold ring bearing the seal of the Custodes Veritas suggested this was indeed Beaumont's final act. The Church's reckoning was swift and secret. Pope Pius IX issued a papal bull, never publicized but leaked by a Vatican clerk, ordering the immediate dissolution of any groups, societies, or movements within the Church that promoted irregular paths to salvation. Dozens of priests across Europe and the Americas were quietly transferred, retired, or in some cases, disappeared entirely. The Convent of Divine Mercy was demolished, its stones scattered and its land declared perpetually unhallowed. The 3 surviving nuns, Sisters Catherine, Marie Joseph, and Therese, faced their own tragic aftermath. The Church, rather than providing care and comfort, treated them as embarrassments to be hidden. They were separated and sent to different asylums in France, officially listed as suffering from religious mania. Sister Catherine died within a year, supposedly of pneumonia, though the asylum records note she had been in good physical health the day before. Sister Marie Joseph survived until 1851, her death certificate listing the cause as melancholia leading to self-harm, though witnesses claimed she had seemed increasingly hopeful in her final weeks, even attempting to communicate through writing about, remembering the truth of what happened. Only Sister Therese lived to old age, dying in 1873. In her final years, she had been transferred to a small convent in Normandy where the nuns knew nothing of her past. She spent her days in the garden, teaching young novitiates sign language, a skill they found curious but charming. Upon her death, they found hundreds of pages hidden in her cell, a detailed account of the horrors at the Convent of Divine Mercy written in tiny script. These pages were immediately confiscated by church authorities and presumably destroyed, though rumors persist that copies were made and hidden in various European monasteries. The broader network of the Custodes Veritas proved impossible to fully root out. Throughout 1848 and 1849, reports surfaced of suspicious deaths and disappearances in religious communities across the Catholic world. A monastery in Bavaria where 12 monks were found dead, apparently poisoned during communion. A convent school in Ireland where 6 young novices vanished, leaving behind only their habits and a cryptic message about joining the eternal choir. A mission in California where an entire indigenous congregation, 43 souls, disappeared after evening mass, their fate never determined. Some members of the network escaped justice entirely. Father Denis Laforme, released on a technicality when key evidence mysteriously disappeared, fled to South America, where he was later reported to have established a new religious community in the mountains of Peru. The Toronto group was never found, though native guides reported finding a makeshift altar deep in the northern forests, surrounded by 17 graves marked only with crosses made from tongue depressors. The horror at the Convent of Divine Mercy, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of religious authority and the human capacity for evil dressed in sacred robes. What happened to those 32 women wasn't merely the work of a madman. It was systematic abuse enabled by an institution more concerned with protecting its image than protecting the innocent. The broader implications ripple through history like blood in water. How many other Father Beaumonts operated in the shadows of religious authority? How many victims were silenced not by surgical removal of their tongues, but by the overwhelming power of institutions that demanded obedience over truth? The Custodes Veritas may have been extreme in their methods, but their fundamental belief that they alone possessed divine truth and had the right to impose it through violence echoes through centuries of religious persecution. What this reveals about human nature is perhaps most disturbing of all. The townspeople of Sainte Marguerite weren't evil, yet they enabled evil through their unquestioning deference to religious authority. Dr. Martel, Sheriff Thibaudeau, the merchants and workers, all good people who saw signs of something wrong but couldn't bring themselves to challenge a man of God until it was too late. The sisters themselves, educated and devout women, were so conditioned to obedience that many submitted to torture believing it was God's will. The lessons that should have been learned from this tragedy were instead buried. Rather than examining how religious authority could be so catastrophically abused, the Church chose suppression and denial. Rather than protecting the vulnerable, they protected the institution. The 3 survivors were treated not as victims deserving justice and compassion, but as embarrassments to be hidden away. Modern parallels, though we might wish to deny them, are unmistakable. When institutions prioritize reputation over truth, when authority figures are considered above suspicion, when victims are silenced to protect the powerful, the same dynamics that enabled Father Beaumont continue to operate. The surgical removal of tongues may seem like medieval barbarism, but how different is it from the psychological silencing of abuse victims, the legal gagging of witnesses, the institutional machinery that grinds truth into silence? The story was hidden for 176 years, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important. It revealed that monsters don't always appear monstrous, that the greatest evils can be committed by those who genuinely believe they're doing good, that institutions meant to nurture faith can become factories of horror when accountability disappears behind walls of sacred privilege. The recent unsealing of these Vatican archives wasn't voluntary. It came only after repeated pressure from historians and the discovery of parallel documents in Montreal that made continued suppression impossible. Even now, the Church maintains that Father Beaumont was an aberration, a single corrupted soul who deceived everyone around him. They refuse to acknowledge the systemic failures that enabled him, the network that supported him, or the institutional cover-up that followed. So I ask you, my brave viewers who have stayed with me through this journey into darkness, what do you think really happened in those final days at the convent? Was Father Beaumont truly insane, or was he the product of an institution that placed obedience above humanity? And perhaps most chillingly, how many other convents, monasteries, and religious communities have similar stories buried in their foundations, waiting to be discovered? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me if your own community has legends of religious houses with dark secrets, stories grandparents whispered but never fully told. Sometimes truth hides in local folklore, waiting for someone brave enough to investigate. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think differently about power and authority and the danger of blind faith, then please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Because I've recently received documents about a boarding school in Manitoba where Indigenous children were subjected to experiments that make Father Beaumont look almost merciful by comparison. Thank you for your courage in listening to Sister Catherine, Sister Marie Joseph, Sister Therese, and their 29 sisters who could no longer speak for themselves. Thank you for ensuring their suffering isn't forgotten, their truth isn't reburied. You, my true crime family, are the ones who keep these stories alive, who demand justice even when it comes a century too late. Remember, the greatest evil thrives not in darkness but in the blinding light of unquestioned authority. Question everything, trust but verify, and always listen for the voices that have been silenced, because sometimes their silence speaks louder than any scream. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking truth.